Hey, screenwriters. So the Oscar nominations came out today, and I have thoughts on them. I can't imagine living in a universe where Joker gets 11 Oscar nominations. That just makes no sense to me. It brought about sort of a realization that I've had for a while now, but it really brought it up to the surface for me, which is that I think it's time for us to, as artists, as screenwriters, as filmmakers, to not take the Oscars so seriously, because they actually have a pretty lousy track record in terms of nominating really great movies and awarding, especially Best Picture, to the most important movie of the year. Part of it is I think the Oscars for years now have had sort of like a brand crisis. Like, I don't know, like, why is an Oscar better than a Golden Globe or better than a BAFTA? I've always felt that the Oscars should nominate and reward movies that they know are going to have the greatest impact on the art and the craft of cinema moving forward. They haven't always done that. Sometimes they have, but they've been so inconsistent with it. I've always wondered if when they do reward movies like that, is it just by accident? Because it doesn't seem by design. Like every couple of years, there's this odd batch of nominations, and then the award for Best Picture goes to a movie that is instantly forgettable. So in case you think I'm making this up, I have receipts. I actually have some examples of what I mean by when the Oscars get it right, they get it right, but when they get it wrong, boy, do they get it wrong. In 1980, do you know who won Best Picture? A movie called Ordinary People, which I guarantee you've never heard of. Do you know who else was nominated that year? Two movies, one called The Elephant Man and one called Raging Bull. How do you give Ordinary People an Oscar over The Elephant Man, over Raging Bull? Two movies that have had outsized impacts in terms of cinema, in terms of storytelling, in terms of the craft of filmmaking. 1989, you know who won the Oscar that year for Best Picture? Driving Miss Daisy. You know who else was nominated in 1989? Field of Dreams and Dead Poets Society. Field of Dreams and Dead Poets Society, two movies that are not just fan favorites in terms of people just watch them all the time. Two really impactful movies in terms of storytelling, two really amazing movies in terms of visual storytelling, in terms of narrative structure, in terms of character development, in terms of, like, these are two touchstone movies in many ways that the Oscars looked over and gave it to a movie that I guarantee you've never seen, never heard of, and has probably never impacted your writing or your desire to get into film the way that these two movies may have. 1990. Do you know who won the Oscar for Best Picture that year? Dances with Wolves. Do you know who else was nominated that year? Do you know what other movie was nominated in 1990? Goodfellas. Goodfellas, admittedly one of my favorite movies of all time, but an absolute masterpiece in terms of cinema, just generically, in terms of story development, in terms of the tragic nature of the character, in terms of the storytelling, in terms of the filmmaking of it, like the actual, just the making of it was amazing. A movie that would cast a very, very long shadow on cinema over the next 20 years. 1994. Do you know who won for Best Picture that year? Forrest Gump. Do you know who else was nominated in 1994 for Best Picture? Pulp Fiction. I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that Pulp Fiction is one of the most influential movies ever in cinema. It changed the trajectory of cinema in numerous ways, in terms of storytelling, in terms of the kinds of characters that you see, in terms of the language of filmmaking itself really evolved with Pulp Fiction. They gave Forrest Gump, which was an excellent movie, the Oscar over a movie that would literally redefine cinema for the next 15 to 20 years. We're still living in the post-Pulp Fiction world. That's how influential that movie was. You know who else was nominated in 1994 for an Oscar for Best Picture? The Shawshank Redemption. An absolute masterpiece of a film, one of the greatest movies ever made. I think it's literally listed as one of the greatest movies ever made by viewers, by watchers. I think it's the highest rated movie on IMDb, if I'm not mistaken, or one of the highest rated movies on IMDb, if I'm not mistaken. It is a movie that has impacted so many people, not just emotionally through the raw journey of the protagonist of that story, but in terms of the craft of filmmaking itself. They picked Forrest Gump over The Shawshank Redemption. Again, the Oscars are bad at this. 1996. The movie that won that year was The English Patient. I honestly think one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my entire life. Do you know who else was nominated that year? Fargo. The Coen brothers' absolute masterpiece of film noir. Like one of the greatest movies ever made, one of the most influential movies ever made, did not get the Oscar. Fargo, by any measure, is far more influential, far more valuable to cinema than The English Patient is. 2010, do you know who won the Oscar that year? The King's Speech. Do you know what else was nominated for an Oscar that year? Inception and The Social Network. Inception, again, a movie that wasn't just a blockbuster, but was an extraordinary feat of cinematics. It was an amazing movie, both technically and artistically and narratively. It was a masterpiece for Christopher Nolan, for a guy who keeps doing masterpieces every movie he makes. Social Network, a monumentally well-written screenplay, probably one of the greatest screenplays ever written, that really helps you. Like, it was a masterclass in filmmaking. If you want to learn how to make a great movie, go watch Social Network. They gave it to The King's Speech. It was, again, a very well done movie, but did it move the needle of cinema? Is it a movie that's going to impact filmmaking for the next 20 or 30 years? No. Is Inception? Absolutely. Is Social Network? Absolutely. The Oscars are not good at finding classics. The Oscars are not good at identifying movies that are going to have the largest cinematic impact, the largest cultural impact, that do not move the needle forward in terms of the art and craft of cinema generically. It shouldn't just be about what's good this year, but is this movie going to be great 10 years from now? Is it going to be impacting cinema 15 years from now, 50 years from now? Are filmmakers going to be heavily influenced by this movie? Is the language of cinema going to evolve because this movie exists? It's sort of ironic to me that Joker's been nominated, given how heavily influenced it's been by Martin Scorsese's work. It's interesting that Joker itself is a movie that looked back in history and said, what movies should we pull from to make the point that we want to make? To me, I'm just not sure that a movie like Joker is going to be that kind of movie 30 years from now, where people are going to look back and go, hey, you know what, let's borrow from this movie called The Joker to tell our story. The Oscars, to me, are more than just about awarding Best Picture. They're about recognizing the movies that are going to be culturally important, that are going to be cinematically important, that are going to grow and contribute to and expand the language of cinema, that are going to change the way movies are made. The reason why I keep going back to Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino, again, regardless of what you think of them as individuals, or even just specifically as filmmakers, there is no doubt that every time they make a movie, the language of cinema changes. Christopher Nolan quickly rising up to the ranks of directors that no matter what he does, the minute it's on celluloid, it changes the nature of cinema forever. 11 Oscar nominations for The Joker? The standard of what I think is going to be a heavily influential movie for the next 10 to 15 years. That to me is a standard for cinema. That to me is a standard for handing out an Oscar. There's a lot of great movies that come out every year. They don't deserve Oscars. Joker, I think, is one of those movies that doesn't deserve it. So that's my video for this week. If you have any comments, you have any questions, drop them in the box below. Happy writing.